Welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing our talks on the triangular trade, but this time we're going to solely be focusing on the Atlantic slave trade and what exactly slaves went through to come here to the Americas just to be forced into labor. So our objectives for today: to describe the Middle Passage, to explain the condition of slavery in the New World, and to evaluate the impact of slaves in America. So here are our essential questions for today. Remember, you don't have to answer and submit these. How were slaves treated along the voyage to the Americas? How did slavery influence the culture of the Americas? And what were the consequences of slavery in the Americas? And our standards for today are 8.4.12. So last time we were together, we talked a little bit about capture along the west coast of Africa, but let's talk about it a little bit more deeply. So the original capture of Africans, which we will be referring to as Africans or as slaves from this point forward, was almost always violent. As European demand grew, whether it was in Europe or the Americas, African chieftains, meaning those people that were at the top of African government, what they would do is they would organize raiding parties to seize individuals from neighboring societies, so maybe from an enemy tribe. They would actually go in the middle of the night and steal people to sell into slavery. Now, other Africans would actually launch wars specifically for the purpose of capturing slaves. So they would use it as an excuse to go in, capture these people, and then sell them into slavery. So obviously, this was not their choice, and they really didn't have any way to go against it. So there are four main ways that Africans are able to become slaves other than these two ways. So one, you could be a criminal and you could be sold as punishment. Two, you were a free African and you were obtained through these night raids like we talked about by those African or European gangs. Third, you were already a slave in Africa and now you're just being resold as another slave. Or four, like we said, you could be a prisoner of war, meaning you were captured in war and now you're being sold. So the Middle Passage is the term that we give to the route that Africans took here to the Americas to become slaves. And the Middle Passage was a terrifying ordeal where these Africans would actually be chained together by their feet, by their hands, and by their necks. And then they would be forced into dark, cramped quarters below the ship's decks where they could neither sit nor stand. Now, they would rarely be fed. People would be getting sick left and right of you. You couldn't do anything about that. People were dying right near you. There were rats. There were fleas. It was a very disturbing journey for them. And this journey would actually last anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. Now, during these journeys, anywhere from 10 to 20% of these Africans did not survive because the conditions were so terrible. Now, they wouldn't just wait till they got to the Americas to deal with these bodies. They would just throw them overboard into the ocean. So it's really showing you there was no respect for human life. There was no respect for these people at this time. So let's talk about slavery in the colonies. So slave traders, we know, carried captive Africans throughout the Americas, whether it was anywhere across North America, the Caribbean, or South America. So the Spanish, who were located in the Caribbean, they primarily used slaves on their sugar plantations, as did the Portuguese in Brazil. Now the English, the ones that we will be focusing on, now they dominated the West Indies where they would bring their slaves, but they also brought slaves to the colonies in North America. By the end of the 1600s, it's going to be the English that are going to dominate the slave trade and start importing more slaves than any other country. So, what types of jobs did these slaves have? Well, most of them ended up working on large plantations where they would farm things like tobacco, sugar, indigo, or cotton. But there were other jobs available, not like they had a choice. Some worked in mines, in towns, or even in the countryside. If you were a skilled craft worker, meaning you had some type of skill, you had some type of thing that you were able to do, like a carpenter, then you could continue those crafts in the Americas if your plantation owners or if the area you were in allowed that. Women slaves were given domestic duties, although there were a large amount of them who still worked in the fields. So here we can see labor in the Americas from the 1400s to the 1800s, and you can see that it's really going to end up being those sugar plantations that are going to be kind of the number one reason for slavery. Now here in North America, in the colonies, it's actually going to be tobacco and cotton, just because we don't have the right weather to grow sugar here in the 13 colonies. So let's talk about living conditions. Slaves had to meet their own basic needs at the end of the workday, meaning they would have to cook for themselves if there was any food, they would have to mend their own clothing, they would have to tend to the sick, and they would have to fit in all of these household duties around the work for the slaveholder. So if you had to work 15 hours in one day and you came home and there was no food, well, then you just didn't eat. And remember, this type of work is very physical. It's going to be very laborious for them. It's going to be tiring. And it's going to be very degrading for them when their plantation owners punish them, because oftentimes they would punish them for very minor offenses, for something like not being to the fields, exactly when the plantation owner was there. But remember, they didn't have clocks or watches, so how were they to know? If they talked back to a master, or if they just walked the wrong way, if they gave them the wrong look, they could often be given physical punishment for that. Now, many slaveholders lived in constant fear of rebellion. Remember, there were quite a few slaves and only one or two of them. So they feared these rebellions by angry slaves who could no longer take the harsh treatments that they faced on plantations. And there actually were a number of slave rebellions here in the Americas, although none of them ended up being successful. So we know that laws in the Americas considered enslaved Africans to be property, meaning slaves had no rights and no freedoms. The slaveholders controlled most conditions under which they lived, and often, like we said, enslaved people would endure brutal treatment or abuse as a result of their punishment. So, what types of resistance did we see? Well, slaves coped with these inhumane conditions in many ways. Some actually resisted by trying to keep their cultural traditions alive, by still following their religions, singing their African tribal songs, and even trying to dress in their African tribal ways when at home and out of the master's eyes. Others would turn to a new religion for strength and for hope, and would start actually bringing in the Christian religion to their own African tribal traditions. Now, some are going to fight back by slowing down the work, actually destroying equipment and not working as quickly as they normally do. So this was one form that the slaves would be able to revolt. Now, some slaves were even able to flee and establish communities of runaways. Now, this was probably the hardest thing to do, because if you were found, then you had to be returned to your slave owner by law. So let's quickly talk about some of the effects of the slave trade. So the Atlantic slave trade was in effect for over 400 years and devastated many West African societies. And there was a major human cost here. There were estimates of anywhere between 15 to 20 million Africans that were shipped to the Americas against their will. Millions more were sent to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. So really, guys, the human cost here was enormous. Countless numbers of these people died in transit to these locations. Millions of them were deprived of freedom, and their descendants, meaning their children, their grandchildren, they were doomed to live lives of forced servitude or forced labor. So by the 1700s, if you were a slave, then you could be guaranteed that your children would be born into slavery and kept in slavery until they died. So let's talk about the effect on Africa. Well, the effects were profound in Africa, as slave raiders would often capture the strongest and the youngest of these African communities, and oftentimes these were the future leaders of these societies. Now, this is going to divide Africans from one another. Instead of working together, now they're working against each other. Like we said before, some rulers even waged wars to gain captives, and that's going to tear apart families, and it's going to lead to a lot of death and destruction. So, forcing millions of these Africans into slavery is not going to enrich Africa, but rather it's going to undermine them, and really is going to be a reason why they're going to be in such shambles in the decades that follow. What about the effect on economies? Well, the forced labor of Africans did actually enrich other parts of the world because now people had free labor and they could increase their profits. So the labor of Africans slaves actually built the economies of many American colonies here in North America. And it also was beneficial that they had some knowledge of agriculture because this contributed to the growth of things like the rice industry in the southern English colonies. So they will benefit the places that they're going to, but you have to ask yourself, at what cost? What are we really forcing these people into? And that's a life of harsh labor, harsh treatment, and unspeakable punishment. And last but certainly not least, we like to say that one effect of slavery was their spread of culture across the world. As a result of the slave trade, people of African descent were able to spread throughout the Americas and Western Europe. We actually call this spreading of people the African diaspora. Now, the important thing here is not necessarily just that the Africans are moving to new locations, but that what they're bringing with them is their culture, their music, their art, their religion, their food, and this is going to spread throughout the Western world. Now, when we have a culture that is diffused or spread out through other parts of the world, we call that cultural diffusion. And some of the results of this African cultural diffusion we still see today. Things like reggae and hip hop in the music world, not to mention the establishment and founding of jazz. We also see new instruments like the banjo. So there are a number of ways that Africans spreading throughout the world and being a part of this enslaved culture did help enrich other cultures and lead to new types of music, new types of art, and new types of religion as well. So now that we're done our topic for this week, go ahead, make sure you answer the questions below, and then you can move on to our next topic. Have a great day, guys.